Well, good morning and welcome to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My special guest with me this morning is the Honourable Mark Latham. Now, this is a very interesting interview for us today because AP normally, as the title goes, is the Australian Presbyterian Profiles in Christian Living. This morning, my guest with me is someone that everybody would know, former Labor leader Mark Latham, now with One Nation in the New South Wales Parliament. But Mark, you describe yourself, at best agnostic, probably closer to an atheist, and yet strangely we have this ironic situation where you are the champion of religious freedom in New South Wales. How did that happen?
Well, Mark, we're going through a period with attacks on many of our institutions by regressive left-wing politics, and it's almost like they're driving us back to the dark ages with many of the things they're doing. And one of their big attacks is to work out in trying to erode our civilizational values that they can attack Christianity. Because whether you're a believer or not, whether you've had religious faith or you've lapsed, we're all, as a society, as a Western civilization, heavily influenced by the values, tenets, and history of Christianity. You know, as I often say to my children, every day when we wake up, we mightn't consciously think of it and talk about it straight away, but how we conduct ourselves during the day, our moral sense of right and wrong, good and bad, the rules of civil society that we follow are heavily anchored in the Bible. The Ten Commandments, for instance, remain in large part guidance in the moral standards of civil society. Whoever he was and whatever his significance, Jesus was undoubtedly the greatest moral teacher in history. He lived, he taught lessons that are timeless and probably more relevant today than even in his own time. So all of those things guide and underpin so many of our civilizational values. And as the left-wing politics sneers at Christianity, attacks people like Margaret Court, Israel Folau, religious freedom has become a frontline battle in civilizational protection. And I'm interested in that. And I recognise one of the essential pillars of our civilization is Christianity, particularly in its moral and civil society dimension. So that's how I'm involved in the struggle. And you don't need to be a believer to recognise the truth of all that and to get involved. So it goes beyond religious faith. Everyone should have a concern of the attempt to sneer at, erode and roll back the very important values of Christian faith.
Yeah, Mark, that's fascinating. And I want to get to something very specific in just a moment, and that is your very important Parental Rights Bill that is in New South Wales. But just before we do that, if I could step back and ask you a bigger meta-narrative question. You were the former Labor leader on a federal level, and it seems that Labor itself, and all the political parties, but Labor has seen a seismic shift in its really basic philosophy. What are your observations as to what has happened in that space?
Well, Labor's disconnected itself from working people at two levels. The climate change debate, they pitch themselves more on the environmental side than protection of jobs. Working people need jobs. And I'm speaking to you from the Hunter Valley. I do a lot of work also in the Illawarra for job protection. So Labor is always on the side of the environmental argument and eroding jobs, and working people essentially, ask for nothing more than a good job, a decent income, a good education for their children, and for the state to allow them to get on with being good parents and good citizens. So it's not rocket science there, but Labor has moved away from job protection and job creation. And the second area of disconnection has been the values of working people, where there is a thing called observable truth, that we know the facts of history, our identity. Yep. We know certain things in life are relatively fixed, that gender fluidity is more an ideology than a reality. And Labor spends a lot of time sneering at working people because they're not part of the postmodernist push where everything is said to be fluid, that we don't really know our history, we don't really know our identity, we don't really know the importance of family, all these things have been socially constructed and working people have been duped. And out of that, Labor spends a lot of time sneering at working people who love their country, love their communities, love their family. And Labor joins in attacking those values and trying to close them down under the banner of cancel culture and political correctness. And, there was a standout example in the lead up to Australia Day just passed, where a Labor Western Australian senator described Australia Day as a celebration of white supremacy. Well, for all those white working class people and, being born white, what can you do about that? That's a huge insult to say it's white supremacy. People love their country. They love the Australian sense of a fair go. They're not supremacists at all. And that Labor senator said it. It's an outrageous and disgusting comment. And she was never disciplined. No one, not Anthony Albanese, no one said, oh, that's wrong, or she'll lose a pre-selection, or she should shut up. So it just shows you that Labor's sneering at working people has disconnected them from working class values, and indeed they're anti-working class values. They see working people as deplorable, as racist and misogynists and homophobes and the like, and they talk down to them and want to control what working people say and think, and the working class heavily resents that.
Look, you make a lot of really good points, particularly that it seems like the irony here, the ultimate irony is that by saying that white people are racist is itself a racist thing just because of the inherent colour of their skin. It seems to me that really a lot of the spirit in which you tackle these issues in the public square is almost like a Labor battler mentality. I mean, the things that we used to think were just given, that there are male and female, now is being called into question. I know that's another issue that you have really championed is gender fluidity in the schools. How have you seen that, can I ask, in New South Wales, that insidious sort of teaching coming into our school curriculum?
Well, transgenderism is an ideology, and unfortunately we've also got some teachers and the Teachers Federation here who think that they should be the parents of the children and the nuclear family should be sidelined. And this is a horrifying development. I came into the state parliament knowing, to its credit, the government here had banned the Safe Schools program, this insidious program out of Victoria promoting gender fluidity. It was banned in New South Wales, but the more I did research about how the system works, it was very clear that hadn't killed off the ideology of gender fluidity and transgenderism. It had simply moved to other parts of the school system. For instance, on Wear It Purple Day last year, a couple of education department officials sent out to 70,000 teachers scores of gender fluidity guides, horrendous material to do with penis tucking and breast binding. And then I uncovered a so-called professional development course run by the New South Wales Teachers Federation, which was basically advising the teachers on different areas of the curriculum, English, maths even, personal development, where they could inject gender fluidity teaching, wellbeing programs, apparently credible areas of the curriculum, they could infiltrate it with gender fluidity teaching, to the point where one of the recommendations was that schools should visit the Sydney Aquarium, not to learn about marine biology, but because they're said to have 2 gay penguins there who hatched an egg. Imagine wasting a full day going to the Sydney Aquarium to tell little kids about that. So it's kind of a sickness to the New South Wales Teachers Federation. And then at the end of this professional development course, which is hidden behind internet paywall, I've found ways of finding access to it in the public interest. The instructor said, well, look, the bottom line here is if you find out anything as a teacher about the gender or sexuality of your students, never tell their parents. Don't tell their parents, because that's a dangerous thing to do. The kids could be endangered. Well, I just find that to be horrific and completely and utterly unacceptable to say that while you can ban safe schools, there's a dozen different ways in which these lunatics are driving this material into the school system. So you need a legal ban on it. It's not sufficient just to ban safe schools. You need an overarching legal ban on this this form of child abuse.
Well, you really do put your finger on the central issue here, and I know this goes to the heart of your parental rights bill, which I'd love to hear more about, because what you're really saying is what's happened is the state is taking control over what is taught to our children rather than parents. So how is your bill seeking to protect parental rights over their children? Can you explain that to our listeners?
Well, the Parental Rights Bill has four important aspects. Three of them haven't received much publicity or controversy.
Okay.
But the four aspects are, firstly, that parents are defined legally as the primary educators of their children, particularly in the space of moral, ethical, spiritual values. And secondly, parents it's compulsory for schools to consult extensively with parents at the beginning of every school year, so the parents know exactly what's coming up in class and coursework. No surprises type policy, because I get so many parents contacting my office that, my 13-year-old daughter came home today and said, "Oh, Dad, English was gender studies yet again." And they think, well, how can that be? Well, isn't English literacy and learning how to express yourself? No, it was gender studies today. So we need to ensure parents have got no surprises in that space. They know everything that's coming up. And then the third element is parents would have a legal right to take their children out of classes and courses that don't fit with their family, moral, ethical values. And so, it's sort of extending the rights of parents to say, I don't think that course that I know about is suitable for my child, and I've got a legal right for the child not to participate. And then finally is the element that has attracted propaganda campaign from Equality Australia and others, and that is to say that in the teaching of gender in schools, it cannot be by the unproven theory of social construction, that teachers are peddling a line in some schools where they'll say to a 7-year-old boy, the only reason you feel male is that when you were born you were dressed in blue and they gave you a Tonka truck. Or to an 8-year-old girl, the only reason you feel female is when you were born you were dressed in pink and given a Barbie doll. That your gender is a social construction. It hasn't been a product of your biological reality. It's been a product of socialisation, if you like, socially constructed. So that's a mutant, unproven, anti-science theory. I mean, we do have a thing called biological science. I've looked at the year 11 and 12 textbook in biology, and it doesn't make any mention of social construction, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But let's stick to the science. We hear, Mark, so much talk about stick to the science, to the science. Well, how about we do that on gender?
Yeah. Last time I checked, every cell has X or Y chromosomes. And so why would we in any way alter our worldview and construct to say that it's anything different? Mark, you raise a lot of very, very important concerns here. Particularly, I'm thinking of parental rights over what their children, and I would think a lot of parents would be aghast at that, to think that their children can be sent off to school, and we know what it's like as parents. You hand your little ones that you dearly love over to the best part of their learning days or the hours of their day to be instructed by someone else. It's a massive step of trust that we are as parents giving to our educators. Now, this is a spicy question. How is this not the sexualization of children? Now, we've heard so much about, particularly in the church, childhood institutional sexual abuse, but how is this gender fluidity and safe schools and like you said before, penis tucking, breast binding, all of these things, how is that not in the light of this current wider context of sexualizing children, how is that not itself raising red flags that our children are being sexualized? Your response?
Well, it is the sexualisation of young children, and I regard it as a form of child abuse. Recently I uncovered at a childcare centre on the northern beaches of Sydney, they sent out an announcement that this month they'll be studying gender fluidity storybooks for 3 and 4-year-old children. Now, at that age, children are struggling with the basics of life.
They're not even toilet trained.
Toilet effectively, how to go to the toilet effectively, how to relate to people, how to talk, maybe start up a little bit of rudimentary reading. They don't have sexual feelings or sexual identities as such. Issues of their gender identity are not, in their top 1,000 priorities as little people. Those things come much later in life. So it's a weird, mutant, abusive type of practice to inflict this upon young children. So it is sexualisation of children, it should be stopped. But to answer your question, where are the red flags? I raise this because it's a reality, and if you don't fight on these realities, why would you be in public life? But a lot of politicians, perhaps more so on the conservative side, look at these issues and sort of think, oh, gee, that's a tough one to take on. Maybe it'll just go away. Maybe if I put my head in the sand for the next couple of years, it'll disappear. Well, it's not disappearing, it's getting worse. And it just tells us that in the conservative mindset, you need to be a fighter. You know, it's not a time for conserving existing institutions. They've been overrun by postmodernist PC left-wing forces, if you like. Yep. You've got to reclaim institutions, you know, and to reclaim institutions from these people, you've got to fight. So it's not a time for a traditional conservative temperament. Yep. It's a time for fighting back and facing up to reality.
Yeah. That's a very good point. I heard somebody once say, just very recently, that now is the time to fight, not to be nuanced. The people that are nuanced are the people that will write the biographies on the fighters in the years to come. But now is the time to fight. Can I, changing topics just a little bit, because I know this is also something that's very close to your heart. It's related to masculinity, domestic violence, and I guess really a feminist push to see everything through the lens that the patriarchy is to blame. Particularly in New South Wales, there's been a big thing about consent training, sexual consent training and education in our schools. Indeed, my own boys go to a church school like yours do, and this has been a big push even there. And my 15-year-old son came home the other day and said, Dad, you know, we're getting told how to basically seduce women in a socially appropriate way. He's 15. You know, the age of sexual consent, legal consent here in New South Wales is 16. So that raised a red flag for me. But my question is this, with consent training, it's all framed within the meta-narrative that it's the patriarchy to blame, that it's men and men's problems with pornography, for instance, that is to blame for the sexual abuse of women. Now, this is a very spicy question to ask you, but your response?
Well, there's a lot of issues there. I think it's, again, an area of left-wing politics without an evidence base. We don't live in a patriarchy. A lot of people are born male and they're heavily disadvantaged for the rest of their life. And I see them out in public housing estates that I've represented over the years. Being born male is not a privilege. If you're poor and you don't get a good education, it'll be a life of welfare dependency no matter your gender. And thankfully in our society, not by the left-wing push, but just the evolution of society, and I suppose some better laws created in the 70s and 80s, we have become a much more gender equal society. Now, we'll still always have the biological reality. I'm not too sure that the left would like to change this, but I'm not too sure they can, that only women can have babies. And women will spend more time out of the workforce as a result of that than men. But it's also true to say in huge, very important areas of vocational professions, they're now female dominated. The law, GP doctors,
the Premier of New South Wales is a woman.
Office managers, some people in politics. You know, these are big, big areas of female domination. And it just shows what behavioural scientists have long said, that men and women are different. Women prefer working with people. So in areas like the law, medicine, office management, veterinarians, well, they're dealing with dogs, but also their owners. You know, these are big areas of female domination, whereas men prefer working with things, working with their hands, working with things. So men tend to dominate areas like IT, you know, computer development, as well as the traditional trades and construction industry. So you can say, well, why isn't the building industry 50% female? Well, maybe the women don't want to work in the building industry. And I've got to say, I've got a 13-year-old daughter. I don't want her to be a labourer on a building site. And she doesn't want it either, I can assure you. So, you know, those things can't be controlled and shouldn't be controlled by the state. They should be a product of the amalgamation of personal choice and freedom. So patriarchy is a flawed theory, but it has underpinned the area you mentioned, these consent programs, and also domestic violence programs, where it's assumed that violence is gendered in our society. But the evidence shows overwhelmingly violence is a product of socio-economic disadvantage. And even the Attorney General in New South Wales, the very woke Mark Speakman, acknowledged this at the estimates on Tuesday in relation to Indigenous people. And I said, well, if it's true of Indigenous people, it should be regarded as true of non-Indigenous living in public housing estates and other disadvantaged areas. So, we've got to attend to the evidence base. There's nothing about being born male that makes you inherently violent or prejudicial to others. You've got to attack domestic violence through the prism of socio-economic disadvantage and attend to the genuine data. And on consent laws, I suppose my starting point, the example you gave about your own 15-year-old son, is that it's a job for you, Mark. It's a job for parents.
Yeah.
Rather than teachers. There's many fine teachers in the system, but essentially they are strangers in our lives. They come and go from schools. They have 6 weeks leave at the end of the year. Parenting is 24/7. Parents are there late at night, on the weekend, in the tough times, always there loving and supporting. And on these issues of what does it mean to be a man, a young man, learning the questions of consent, well, the father has got to be the primary educator. And only with the consent of parents should schools get involved in this space. And I'd expect around the country, the vast majority of fathers do a very good job passing on that message of consent to their sons. So schools should get on with maths, English, history is a strange notion. Schools should get on with maths, history, English, geography, science, subjects where New South Wales has been going backwards, sliding down the comparative league tables, and we should get back to academic excellence in our schools first and foremost.
Yeah, amen. That's a very good point. And while a lot of people might reject or have an emotional response to what you're saying, I can say it's true. I myself have done quite a bit of research into LGBTI domestic violence, which is 3 to 4 times higher than heterosexual domestic violence. Now they would blame it on other factors such as homophobia, but you can't explain that domestic violence between 2 lesbians is because of patriarchy. It just doesn't work. There's no man involved.
Haven't they got a strange theory, the left, of internalised patriarchy and internalised misogyny?
Yeah.
Look, all these things are too weird. And at one level they're comical, but it's a strange thing that there's nutters out there who believe this stuff, but they've got a theory for everything, so be careful.
Whatever you believe, the patriarchy is to blame. Mark, I know you're really busy. I really appreciate your time. One final question, and it's a little bit more of a lighthearted one, I think, because earlier this week you had a bit of a clash with Mark Scott from the Education Department about the resilience donut, which in itself is just one of those phrases where you think, what on earth has that got to do with anything? What does it even mean? Were you able to get an answer?
Well, I raised it because I knew of at least one school in Sydney where they teach the resilience donut. This is the trend where they bring in these external consultants into government schools. They're not necessarily qualified or been accredited or have an evidence base or evaluation or a feedback loop for their work. It's all very random and uncontrolled. And I had in front of me not just Mark Scott, but the whole senior executive level of the Department of Education, and said, "What's a resilience donut?" And Mark Scott said, "Is that a riddle?" Well, I suppose it is a riddle as to what it can mean, why it's being taught in our schools, why we're spending taxpayers' money on these type of consultants. Because I looked up the firm that must make a good coin out of this. They're based at Epping in Sydney, and the person running it describes herself as a human condition guru. Teaching kids the resilience donut. Now, obviously, it's got something to do with resilience. I think most kids would wish it was a real donut they could eat and be a bit more valuable than this kind of nonsense eating up the school day. But no one on the senior executive of the Education Department had any idea what a resilience donut was. So I just said, well, look, nobody here knows anything about it. Isn't this a sign that we've got to start accrediting these external providers? No, really, no one should go into a school unless someone has tested their qualifications, their experience, their evidence base, and said, well, you are fit to stand in front of our schools and discharge the high responsibility of imparting things upon someone else's children. And we need that accreditation system to make sure that if the resilience donut has some overwhelming benefits for children, yeah, sure, but I regard that as unlikely and a sign of just how random and at one level ridiculous the system has become.
Mark, Thank you so much. I've really appreciated your time this morning, and your insight into so many of these things. And I can say I know a lot of people, both sides of political persuasion historically, have really been, I guess, impressed with your courage to fight these things and just to really call a spade, and that black is black and, well, white is racist. I think we can still say that. But, mate, appreciate your time, appreciate what you're doing. I know you yourself would say you're not a believer, but as Presbyterians, as people who believe the Bible, we do pray for all of our parliamentarians, and we pray for you. We really do. Thank you for what you're doing.
I did have a very kind person in politics, a very strong religious faith, say to me in regard to all this work I'm doing, and I often think of this comment that he said, God does not always choose the obvious to do his work.
Well, look, mate, that's true. And can I just say to you, he often chooses very unlikely, even unbelievers, to proceed with his purposes here on earth, like King Cyrus. So, mate, you could be in the league of some very famous people that have come before you. So,
yeah, well, we all need as much help as we can get in this battle. So I'm very happy to hear that. Yeah,
mate, really great to talk to you. And I hope in the future we can talk again, because I really appreciate your insight into this space. And look, even if you don't agree with Mark, even if you are listening to this morning and it's rustled your feathers, I think it's been a stimulating conversation, and I hope that this has been something that has definitely spurred you on, has piqued your interest, because these are very, very important issues. And as Mark said, issues that are common to us all, no matter what political persuasion we have, because it's fundamentally about the rights of parents to educate their children. I think that's something that particularly every believer can say, that this is of fundamental importance, because as the Bible itself says, it is up to fathers to teach and train their children in particular. So, Mark, thank you once again. Really appreciate your time. Every blessing to you, and we'll keep you in our prayers. Thanks, mate.
Pleasure. Thanks, Mark. All the best.